High atop the snow-capped peaks of Mount Denali, thoughts of despair and agony plagued the mind of Zulkifli bin Yusuf, who grew weaker with each passing breath. Frostbite left his toes and fingers numb as sub-zero temperatures forced him deeper within the ice cave atop the mighty peaks of Mount McKinley. Amidst the physical toll enforced by the brutal weather, dread filled his sober mind. Eventually, the unfortunate hiker succumbed to the horrifying effects of altitude sickness, and this frozen mountain became his early grave. From claustrophobic ice caves to the freezing cold waters of a treacherous and unforgiving river, here are 3 horrific Alaskan hiking deaths you've probably never heard of. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Few people know the unforeseen dangers that lurk in the Alaskan wilderness like Mccunn, a wildlife photographer who embarked on an ambitious solo trip deep into the bush in 1981. As the warmer months of March rolled in that year, Mccunn organized for a bush pilot to drop him off at an isolated region around 225 miles northeast of Fairbanks, where he intended to photograph wildlife for up to 5 months. Little did he know then, but this would be the last time he would ever speak with family or friends face to face. Mccunn was no stranger to extended periods away from society, having previously lived for 5 months on the Brooks Range in 1976. But this adventure was far more daring and required a greater deal of preparation. The experienced outdoorsman was aware of this and meticulously planned his lengthy stay in the wilderness. He brought over 1,400 pounds of provisions, including plenty of food to see him through to the end of summer, 2 rifles, a shotgun, and over 500 rolls of film. The pilot was instructed to drop him off at an unnamed lake located deep within the Arctic Circle. When the photographer arrived, the beauty of the region immediately took him aback, and it was everything he had hoped for. A remote, untouched landscape surrounded by dense forests, snow-capped mountains, and native wildlife. But before the 34-year-old even touched the ground, he had made the first in a series of considerable mistakes that would eventually come back to haunt him. Despite being flown to the secluded region by an air taxi service, he had instructed the pilot that a friend would return to pick him up at the end of his trip. Due to financial strains, Mccunn had hoped this would save him money in the long run. However, a misunderstanding between him and his pilot friend resulted in the photographer having no planned ride home, a situation he didn't fully realize until it was already too late. Nonetheless, upon arrival, Mccunn became entrenched by the local wildlife, which had begun to migrate back to their usual summer grounds by this time. He spent the next few months capturing breathtaking moments of nature. Mccunn initially hoped to use his photos to fund another trip, but as summer ended, excitement turned to dread, as seen in his diary entries. Over the spring and summer months, the photographer kept a detailed journal of his daily life, shedding light on the wonders he experienced during his prolonged stay amidst nature. And unfortunately, here is the second fatal mistake he would make. If you've watched my channel, you know that I cover a lot of pretty awful mistakes and horrific injuries. Even if you're not an extreme hiker like Mccunn, it seems like freak injuries are everywhere you look. And here's something you might not know. If you ever do find yourself seriously hurt, your injury could be worth millions. That's where Morgan & Morgan comes in. They fight back when insurance companies try to lowball your claim if you become their client. They recently secured verdicts of $12 million in Florida and $26 million in Philadelphia, 34 and 40 times higher than the initial offers respectively. And even better, their fee is absolutely free unless you win your case. If you ever got seriously injured, your case could be worth millions, and you're only a few easy cell phone clicks away from potentially changing your life. It's really easy. You can start your claim now with Morgan & Morgan at www.forthepeople.com/extreme. You can check the description or scan the QR code on screen to get started. Back to Mccunn's second deadly decision. Sometime after arriving, Mccunn prematurely disposed of 5 boxes of shotgun shells in the river near his camp, thinking he would not need this stockpile of ammunition. But again, this grave mistake would have dire consequences in the coming months. As the weather grew colder, and Mccunn's supplies began running low in early August. The first signs of anxiety started to appear in his writings. Now clearly beginning to worry about the absence of his friend pilot, he wrote, "I think I should have used more foresight about arranging my departure. I'll soon find out." But little did the wildlife enthusiast know that the plane would never arrive. By the middle of August, it became apparent to Mccunn that his pilot friend would not be coming to retrieve him. The unsettling reality of his situation began to set in, and the photographer now began to ration his food, albeit it was a little too late. He turned to hunting in an attempt to make the last of his provisions last longer. Mccunn shot muskrats and ducks, and at one point, he even tried drying the meat of a caribou he found dead in a lake. However, as he had thrown away the vast majority of his ammo into the lake months prior, the photographer was also forced to conserve what little ammunition he had, further inhibiting his chances of hunting sustenance. Despite the weather remaining relatively warm at around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, it began to rain heavily, and strong winds blowing up from the south started to take a toll on his morale. Around this time, another entry into his diary showcases his frustration with the entire situation as worry begins to plague his mind. Certainly, someone in town should have figured something must be wrong. But clearly annoyed with his unforeseen circumstances, he next suggests no one ever cares about his whereabouts, writing, "Then again, there's probably no one in town who gives a..." Shortly after this passage in his diary, another fatal mistake would soon come back to haunt the photographer. Mccunn had previously told his dad not to worry, should he not return by the summer, as there was a chance he might stay on a little longer if things were going well. Despite this, he did leave 3 maps with his campsite marked in case of an emergency, but again, he explicitly told his father not to worry. During a previous trip, Mccunn returned later than initially planned, and his father had contacted the police. This would undoubtedly serve as the second fatal mistake made by the photographer. Late in August, Mccunn thought he had received a lifeline when an Alaska state trooper flew over the lake and spotted the lone camper on the ground below him. As the pilot circled 3 times over the camp, he claimed the photographer appeared to be fine and was walking back to his tent. However, the reality couldn't be further from the truth, as backed up by another passage in his journal. On the second pass, he threw his shoulder high into the air, frantically shaking his fist. In his words, he said, "It was like when your team scored a touchdown or something. Turns out that's the signal for all okay, do not wait." Distraught with missing his chance to get rescued, Mccunn had to accept that he was alone in the wilderness. As the next few months passed by, Mccunn tried to survive as best he could. He set rabbit snares in hopes of salvaging small amounts of meat to quiet his stomach rumblings, but foxes and wolves constantly raided his traps. The weather grew increasingly colder, and Mccunn's morale had dropped to an all-time low by November. His food supplies had run dry, and the game became increasingly scarce due to the snow and freezing conditions. At this point, he debated walking 75 miles to Fort Yukon, but the harsh weather and lack of proper food left him in a weakened state and unable to make the long journey. Around this time, a frightening entry is found in his diary, highlighting the horrifying nature of the photographer's situation and his deteriorating mental state. Mccunn wrote, "If things get too miserable, I've always got a bullet around, but I think I'm too chicken for that. Besides, that may be the only sin I've never committed." By Thanksgiving, he was in a state of constant chills and having dizzy spells as frostbite began to cover his hands. Now unable to set snares, Mccunn had all but run out of options for food, and death by starvation loomed. Sometime after this, he accepted his fate and decided to end his own life as opposed to sustaining further suffering at the hands of the harsh Alaskan winter. In a chilling final entry in his journal, using what remained of his strength, Mccunn explained how he had gathered up what small amount of wood he had left and decided to use it all on one last fire. "I'm burning the last of my emergency Coleman light and just fed the fire the last of my split wood. When the ashes cool, I'll be cooling along with them," he said. As the fire burned hot, Mccunn decided there was no other option and instructed whoever may stumble upon his body to leave it beneath a tree so that a critter might enjoy a meal. By mid-January, his friends and family became increasingly worried about his whereabouts and contacted the authorities. Less than a month later, on February 2nd, a ski-equipped plane carrying several state troopers managed to land close to Mccunn's campsite, and upon inspection, they found his frozen corpse inside his zipped tent. Alongside his remains, they found his diary and a note pinned to his driver's license left for his father, which instructed him on how to develop the film. The untimely death of this wildlife enthusiast serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of extended stays in the wilderness. His reluctance to properly organize a return flight, coupled with his inability to ration food properly, and missing his only rescue opportunity, all contribute to one of the most tragic deaths in Alaskan history. As we go from bad to worse, our next story takes us to the towering peaks of Denali, North America's tallest mountain range. In May 2024, Zulkifli bin Yusuf and two climbing friends, all of whom listed their address as the Alpine Club of Malaysia, in Subang Jaya, Selangor, Malaysia, embarked on a journey to reach the summit of this iconic mountain. Rising to a height of over 20,000 feet, extreme caution is advised to all who set off on the lengthy hike to reach the peak of this Alaskan landmark. Unpredictable weather, deep crevasses, and the ever-looming threat of altitude sickness claim the lives of many adventurers each year. Despite the risks, bin Yusuf and his team were adamant they could make the climb, as two of the climbers had previous experience climbing Denali. Yusuf himself successfully summited high-elevation mountains in the past, such as Aconcagua in Argentina and Elbrus in Russia. Little is known about the direct path the climbers took up the mountain, but they undoubtedly faced mild blizzards, high winds, and challenging terrain as they slowly ascended to the peak. Known for its vicious weather, Denali is considered the toughest of the 7 summits, a term used to describe the highest peak on each of the 7 continents. Climbers should also expect heavier load carries, all of which makes this ascent a particularly challenging physical endeavor. For those who dare to take on this risky adventure, the round trip can take experienced mountaineers up to 18 days. By May 27th, Yusuf and his peers were approaching the snow-capped summit of Denali. But this is when everything started to go wrong. Park rangers received an SOS message from the climbers on May 28th at 1 a.m., who had begun to experience severe hypothermia due to the freezing temperatures. It was around this time that they realized they couldn't descend and began frantically digging into the thick snow in hopes of finding shelter from the harsh weather that had taken a turn for the worse. The 3 climbers shielded themselves from the wind in a snow cave 19,000 feet above sea level. Altitude sickness had started to set in, and the men, now suffering from exhaustion and dehydration, found themselves in a dangerous situation. But it wasn't just the physical ailments that lowered their morale. As the temperature continued to drop, they undoubtedly huddled closer and closer within the confinement of the ice cave, in hopes of conserving any and all body heat. Despair likely flooded their minds, as it became increasingly apparent that their situation would only get worse if rescue services were unable to reach them. Despite suffering from frostbite and hypothermia, one of the climbers rose from the shelter of the ice cave and managed to descend down several thousand feet to a base camp in a daring attempt to save his own life. His perseverance paid off, and he was rescued later that evening. As for the other 2 men, they were forced to remain in the icy cave atop Denali. On the ground below, rescue services got to work on devising a plan to save the remaining 2 climbers. But brutal sub-zero temperatures and high-altitude conditions made survival almost impossible. Weather conditions continued to worsen on May 29th, meaning rescuers couldn't reach the stranded climbers. That evening, further panic began to set in for the climbers, as they sent a flurry of messages to the authorities claiming their InReach device was at 1% battery. With minimal survival gear, we can only imagine the mental torment the climbers suffered as it appeared. Every chance of survival was slipping away from their grasp. Finally, on the evening of Thursday, May 30th, the rescue services attempted to get a helicopter in the air. The park's high-altitude helicopter pilot used his expertise to drop a bag with survival gear near the snow cave. He was astonished to see a climber waving at him as he began to pull away due to strong winds preventing a rescue at that time. The weather finally cleared the following morning, allowing the rescue team to get a helicopter in the air. As they quickly made their way toward the climbers, there was a good chance both had already perished due to frostbite and altitude sickness. As the helicopter arrived at the ice cave, it dropped a short-haul rescue basket. A 47-year-old climber, barely conscious at this point, managed to gather up what little strength he had left and emerged from the snow cave. At this point, he was severely hypothermic and suffering from severe dehydration, but with everything he had, he thrust himself into the basket before being quickly airlifted to safety. Now, it was a race against time. The pilot quickly descended to the 7,200-foot Kahilgna base camp. From here, the survivor was taken to the Talkeetna State Airport to catch a LifeMed air ambulance flight, a specialized medical flight equipped to handle severe hypothermia and dehydration cases. But this is, unfortunately, the end of the rescuers' success. Now alone at Denali, the state troopers had hoped to return for Yusuf, but little did the authorities know at the time that the Malaysian climber had already succumbed to exposure and altitude-related illness. Once flown to the hospital, the surviving friend informed the authorities that Yusuf died several days before he was rescued. His body was later recovered by the park's high-altitude helicopter pilot, with an NPS mountaineering patrol providing ground support. A statement later released by Denali's park website provides a stark reminder of the dangers associated with the climb. Due to the many environmental difficulties, including wind, visibility, altitude, and terrain, it is rare that we or anyone can help in a timely manner should you and your teammates find yourself in need of a rescue. For the two friends who accompanied Yusuf on this fatal journey, they managed to make quick recoveries. Luckily for the last climber, who was pulled from the mountain 2 days after Yusuf had already passed, he made it to Anchorage Hospital before any serious symptoms of frostbite began to set in. Here, the unnamed climber made a full recovery and was even walking the following day, despite the grueling and terrifying experience. Yusuf's heartbreaking story is one in a long list of people who attempt to summit Denali but never return. The horror and dread that come with being stranded over 19,600 feet atop Denali is frightening, and luckily, most of us will never experience such a situation. The heartbreaking story reinforces the dangers of such adventures and will continue to remind the world of just how unforgiving high-altitude climbing can be. If you thought the previous story was horrifying, we guarantee you the next one will have the hairs on the back of your neck standing up. It begins with 24-year-old Veronika Micamava and her husband, Piotr Markielau, who embark on a journey to reach the infamous bus once used as a shelter by Christopher McCandless. Unfortunately, this daring adventure would have horrifying consequences for the lovers. McCandless was an American adventurer who sought to live a nomadic life in the Alaskan bush. Despite dying at the young age of 24, he became an icon for those seeking a sense of wanderlust after becoming the subject of the non-fiction book Into the Wild, written by John Krakauer. His story was later made into a feature film, further highlighting McCandless's free spirit and migratory lifestyle. Fascinated by his story, Micamava and her husband set off to find the iconic bus in July 2019. It sat in a large clearing overlooking the Sushana River. However, reaching the site was no easy task. It was located around 20 miles along the historic Stampede Trail in Alaska, and to get there, hikers would have to overcome a plethora of challenges. Despite the trail's remote location in the Denali borough of Alaska, with only a short paved section before transitioning into a primitive, often dangerous trail that requires high-clearance vehicles or ATVs to access, the couple remained determined. Their love for adventure and the thrill of the unknown drove them to reach the particularly isolated part of the trail where the rusty green and white Fairbanks City Transit bus sat. Like many brave adventurers who had gone before them, they were prepared to cross the near-impossible Teclanica River to reach the abandoned vehicle. During the summer months, this body of water is particularly dangerous as snow melts rapidly, causing the river to swell with high water levels, making crossing extremely difficult and potentially life-threatening. McCandless himself had a close call with this river and almost drowned when he attempted to cross in 1992. Unbeknown to him and many others who faced the Teclanica, an abandoned, hand-operated cable car was present downstream. Nonetheless, when the couple approached the river, they were filled with enthusiasm, being a few short miles from the bus. Their passion for adventure was evident as they quickly tried to overcome the challenge of crossing, but tragedy would soon strike. Mccunn went first, but in her eagerness to cross, the young woman slipped and was submerged under the rapidly flowing waters. The river was higher and faster than usual because of recent rains. The profound strength of the crashing water dragged her along as she desperately fought to keep her head above the crashing waters. All her husband could do was frantically chase behind, his heart pounding with fear and helplessness, hoping she could grasp onto something and pull herself to safety. As the unrestrained power of the water began to fill her lungs slowly, time was running out. Finally, Markilau caught a break and managed to pull his wife's body out of the water around 100 feet downriver. But by then, it was already too late. As dread and angst undoubtedly flooded the mind of the young man, it quickly became apparent his unconscious wife had drowned. He tried his best to resuscitate her, but it was in vain, and she would later be pronounced dead at the scene. Veronika and Piotr had recently married and were on what was supposed to be an unforgettable adventure together. Instead, their dream trip ended in absolute devastation. Piotr could do nothing but watch on helplessly as his wife was carried away by the freezing river, unable to save her. Recalling the disturbing experience at a later date, he claims it was the worst moment of his life. The desire for adventure in this newlywed couple resulted in a terrifying and heartbreaking ordeal that many of us simply cannot comprehend. In the decades since McCandless famously used the bus as short-term accommodation, dozens of people have found themselves in grave danger during their attempts to see the vehicle in person. In May 2013, 3 German hikers set off on an escapade to catch a glimpse of the iconic vehicle. They ventured along the lengthy Stampede Trail, which is found 10 miles from the renowned Denali National Park. They managed to succeed where many couldn't and successfully crossed the treacherous Teclanica River, making their way to the worn-out bus. While it may have appeared as a landmark achievement, trouble soon arose for the European hikers. As they began to make their way back to civilization, they once again had to cross the dangerous river. But now it was all but impossible due to the high, swift-running water. With only around gear days of supplies, the seasoned adventurers knew they were in trouble and decided to reach out to state troopers who sprang into action. Eventually, they were rescued, but their initial trouble highlights how menacing the Teclanica can become at any moment. Unfortunately, not everyone was as lucky as the German hikers. As we know, Mccunn lost her life trying to cross the vicious running waters. But this wasn't the only life the treacherous river would take. In 2010, a Swiss woman, Claire Ackerman, had been venturing through the Stampede Trail and found herself less than a mile from where Chris McCandless's body was found all those years ago. The 29-year-old was determined to cross the Teclanica River, and in an attempt to brace themselves against the fast-moving water, Ackerman and her hiking partner tied ropes around their waists. Then they proceeded to attach their hopes to another string between 2 study trees on opposite sides of the river. But a serious problem arose. The ropes had too much slack. Despite this, they continued on with their attempts, unaware that tragedy would soon strike. As they began moving through the water, the crashing force swept the 2 hikers from their feet, dragging them beneath the surface of the water. The ropes now became a serious hazard, as the slack forced the rope to droop into the water, keeping them mostly submerged. As Ackerman gasped for air, taking in more water each and every time she was pulled under, her partner finally managed to cut himself free, and was carried a short distance downstream. He frantically rushed back to Ackerman, who by now had been stuck underwater for several minutes. He cut her rope, and the pair were swept around 900 feet downstream. As he pulled her lifeless body from the water using all the strength he had left, the young Frenchman tried his best to perform CPR, but it was useless. The relentless power of the river had claimed Ackerman's life. The tragic stories of Mccunn and others who sought to cross the dangerous in hopes of where the nomadic adventure McCandless took his final breaths. For Mccunn, she would pay the ultimate price in her attempts to reach the Into the Wild bus. A honeymoon adventure quickly turned into an absolute nightmare, as she was swept away by the same deadly river that almost claimed the life of Chris McCandless. This tragic accident is a stark reminder of the true power possessed by Mother Nature. While it can be easy to romanticize survivalism, more often than not, nature isn't just wild and beautiful, it's mercilessly unforgiving. As we look back at the stories covered in today's videos, several simple and effective tips could help save your life if you ever find yourself facing danger in the Alaskan wilderness. Always check updated weather forecasts, pack an emergency communication device, and never underestimate the value of a strong team. Want to support the channel? Join for exclusive perks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.